Shabbat Shalom to everyone. It's an honor to be able to speak with you tonight on this Shabbat as it is every week. How many of you were afraid of the dark as a child? Nathan?
Yeah.
I was. And when I was 9 years old, I went to overnight camp, and the cabin was completely dark at bedtime. And the only way that I could endure my fear was to find a small crack in the shuttered window. So I'm in this, I think I was on the top bunk. I'd look out the window and the shutters were closed, but there's a little bit of light. And that small bit of light allowed me to endure the evening of fear. That early fear evidently has stayed with me and produces yearly my visceral reaction to the ninth plague, the plague of darkness. In the Torah, the process of getting out of Egypt is a complex one. The Israelites just don't announce they're leaving, and then Pharaoh throws them some going away party. It's a struggle that requires a series of catastrophic plagues which God brings against Egypt. And we know the plagues from the Seder: blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locust. The ninth plague, the plague of darkness, and the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn. Each one of them is of increasing intensity. And here's what the Torah says about the ninth plague. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, hold out your arm towards the sky that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched." It's such an interesting touched. Moses held out his arm towards the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another. For 3 days, no one could get up from where he was. But then the section ends with, "But all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings." We can interpret the plague literally. The darkness was some kind of substance that obstructed light. Josephus says, dense darkness without a particle of light enveloped the Egyptians. The darkness so thick that their eyes were blinded by it, and their breath choked, and they either met with miserable end or lived in terror of being swallowed up by the fog. Poetic and frightening. Now, I don't read the Torah literally, and I'm more concerned what it means. And my question is, what did the plague of darkness do? One Hasidic commentary suggests the following: the greatest darkness is when a person does not see his fellow human being and does not participate in the distress of others. Quote, "They did not see one another. They did not feel one another's distress. Their senses were dulled." The Egyptians, therefore, were these pathetic beings blinded to the Hebrew suffering. And that is the history, unfortunately, of the world. When the powerful ignored the suffering of the powerless. When the dominant culture dismisses the minority culture. When we become blinded in our own security to the reality of the insecure. When our narcissism obliterates our concern for the other. And what does it mean that there was light in the Hebrews' homes? How were they exempt from the darkness? It's not that they had good flashlights or good candles. The Torah is trying to tell us something about the spiritual life of the Hebrews. They created families. They created households. They created communities, a view of life where being blinded to others is forbidden. Their years of enslavement opened their eyes. Their experiences taught them to care. That is Judaism at its best. That's why the Passover Seder begins with the opening of the door and announcing, let all who are hungry come and eat. How dare we feast if there are hungry people at the doorstep? Most people are not familiar with the French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, but his teaching is so relevant in our trying to understand this ninth plague. Here is Levinas's great religious question. His question is, what makes us human? For Levinas, the awareness of myself depends on some other human being whose face I see and to whom I am responsible. To be myself is to be open to the presence of the other before me. Even more, the primary way God is present to me is through the presence of the other. I'm looking at Becky and Nathan. I see their faces. In the act of seeing them, it's not just seeing them. I have to take responsibility for them on some level. That's what the human-to-human relationship is about. Levinas says we can't talk to God, only to each other. And when we care for others in words and deeds, we come as close as we can to God. We know God when we act ethically towards another person. Everything I can ever know about God is experience in caring for others, literally seeing them. That Levinas teaching is unbelievable. I believe that this was the message of President Biden at his inauguration. He didn't give an inaugural address. To me, it was a kind of ecumenical, non-political sermon. A forceful theme in his address was how we need to see each other, to overcome our blindness, to see the other person as images of God, even when we do not share their vision of the world. This is a bit of what President Biden said, but the answer is not to turn inward, to retreat into competing factions, distrusting those who don't look like you do, or worship the way you do, or don't get the news from the same sources you do. We must end this uncivil war that pits red against blue, rural versus urban, conservative versus liberal. We can do this if we open our souls instead of hardening our hearts. And beautiful biblical reference. If we show a little tolerance and humility. If we are willing to stand in the other person's shoes just for a moment. Because here is the thing about life. There is no accounting for what fate will deal you. There are some days when we need a hand. There are other days when we are called on to lend a hand. That is how we must be with one another. And if we are this way, our country will be stronger, more prosperous, more ready for the future. My fellow Americans, in the work ahead of us, we will need each other. A beautiful religious message. If we as Americans are blinded by tunnel vision, if we are comfortable in our own cocoon of dark indifference, if we live in our own self-imposed plague of darkness, if we dwell on earth with blinders on, there's no hope. But if we open our eyes and see the other person, things can be different. Perhaps Biden's vision is utopian. And of course, he's a smart man and knows that words are one thing, but reality is another. But that's what religion is about. That's why religion means something very personal and important to me. That's what faith is about. That is what his Catholicism teaches him, which guides President Biden's vision of a life well lived. And what is that? To know what we want the world to be, to keep plugging along towards the ideal, and having the strength to endure when our ideals are nullified by failure and fate. Friends, we Jews have lived through dark times. And these are the darkest of times. Over 400,000 people dead, 800 small businesses closed daily. People still die alone. The vaccine is here, but too scarce. But our Torah portion says that we can see beyond the darkness and to create light in the world. Amanda Gorman's poem at the inauguration ended this way. When day comes, we step out of the shade. aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to see it. The Jews have shown the world time and again that even in the darkest of times, we can create illumination. And as William Shakespeare wrote in The Merchant of Venice, how far that little candle throws his beams, so shines a good deed in a weary world. Shabbat Shalom.